Greetings again, everybody. So we start a final non-theistic, anti-theistic argumentation from another school. Okay, so we've had Mimamsa, and we've had the Buddhists, and we've had the Jains, and one of the what's later known as the six schools of Indian philosophy, Sāṅkhya, which will encounter a lot of Sāṅkhya metaphysics in the Gita and in the Yoga Sutras, which is the last part of the course. So the school of Sāṅkhya is a metaphysical school. Now, many forms of which were theistic, but there was a non-theistic form. And we're reading that non-theistic tradition. It's a Sāṅkhya text, Sāṅkhya being one of the schools of traditional Hindu philosophy, like there's Vedanta, the Vedanta school, Yoga school, and so forth. And one of them is Sāṅkhya. And essentially the Sāṅkhya metaphysics is that if you sort of dissolve all reality into its irreducible ultimate components, right? You can't dissolve it anymore. Just like a physicist would say, you could dissolve this into, atoms and molecules, and subatomic particles. And then eventually, perhaps you come to some, of course, the physicists don't know at what point you arrive at some fundamental core. Right now, they're proposing strings. But even if the string theory becomes accepted, how do you know the strings are not? There's something more subtle underpinning strings. But Sāṅkhya would say, if you go through that process of reducing everything to its, you do get to an ultimate stop sign. Its subtlest core, it can't be reduced anymore. It's called irreducible. Can't reduce it to anything subtler. And those two things are Purusha and Prakriti. The Atman, Purusha, and Prakriti, what we've encountered so many times. So, and Prakriti consists of the three gunas. We don't need to talk about too much now. Sattva, Rajas, and three qualities, just like colors, red, yellow, and blue, and they mix and you get an infinity of colors. So Prakriti consists of these three gunas, right? Rajas, which is energy, Tamas, which is stillness and lethargia, Sattva, which is light and ethereal, and all things are what they are. This is different from this because of the different composition of the gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, right? It's like color. This blue, got my laundry sitting on my bench here. This blue is different from that blue because this will have more whatever it is, red, and this will have more yellow, and whatever the reasons are, okay? So that's Sāṅkhya. And the early Sāṅkhya texts are lost. And so we're reading the Yuktadipika. You don't need to read the whole introduction to this unless you're interested in the history of Sāṅkhya. But if you're just interested in the arguments, which this course is about, the arguments against Īśvara, then you don't need to read on the article, page 119, all the way to 133. Feel free to read it, but it won't be on the quiz. And it gives a historical background, okay? We are interested in the philosophical arguments, which start on page 134 in the Yuktadipika, and it's verses 84.24 to 88.5. So it's a section of this text called the Yuktadipika. You don't need to know that. Just know that it's Sāṅkhya, S-A-M-K-H-Y-A, right? So let's bring up our text. That we're going to have one session on this, and that's it. Now, for the second lecture of this week, we have my colleague, used to be a student at Rutgers, wrote the book that we're reading, God in Indian Philosophy, Matthew Dusty. They very kindly taped just a 45-minute introduction to the next reading, which will be Nyaya, yet another school, Nyaya, the logicians. I'll introduce them then. Okay, 6 schools. We have Vedanta, we know, Yoga, Sāṅkhya we're doing today. There's Mimamsa, the ritualists, and there's Nyaya, the logicians, and Vaisheshika, another school that we're not going to be encountering in this course. So he taped a 45-minute sort of intro to sort of help us map the arguments that the theists then, in response to some of these non-theistic arguments, the theist logicians direct in the defense of Īśvara. That'll be next week. It's only 45 minutes, so that means my lecture can be a little bit longer because I don't want to have 3 videos, right? one today, and then his is only 45. I don't want to do another 45-minute video. So let's just read this, and whatever time it takes to read, there's only 9 pages. That will be our lesson and our last reading. Remember, we're really trying to engage primary sources. Other than the Jain article and the Buddhist article, and that would have been very, very hard if we'd engaged the primary sources for those. But I might look around in the future for some user-friendly, Jain, a nice section from a Jain text. So if I teach this course again, this is the first time I actually teach the course with a focus on Īśvara. So Yukti Deepika, let's bring it up on the screen. Here it is. And we kick off, okay? So he starts off with the same principal argument. What would it be? 134. Is to be recognized also in refuting Īśvara as the cause of the universe. The same argument as what? Well, previously he's rejected Purusha as the cause of creation, based on the fact that Purusha is not a doer. There's no agency in Purusha. Agency means free will. That you're free, you have the agency, the power, the internal autonomy. It's called free will in religious language, to act. And Sāṅkhya takes a hardline position on this and says, no, there's no agency in the Atman, because if there was agency, Atman would change, right? There would be an Atman, and then it would decide to do something, and it would exert its will to enact that thing. So there's a change involved then. And if Atman is eternal, it can't change. Remember that axiom. He's going to use the same argument from Īśvara, right? So the same principle of our argument is to be recognized also in refuting Īśvara. Same as the Buddhists. Remember the Buddhists? If you have Īśvara before creation, and then Īśvara decides to create, and then Īśvara post-creation, well, that's a different Īśvara. So how can you say Īśvara is eternal and he's changed? Right. So let's go. Now, there exists such an, now he's going to introduce his opponent. Remember the Purva Paksha? Remember, for Indian philosophy always has the Purva Paksha opposing point of view. Purva, other Paksha side. So that's getting introduced. He's going to introduce that. There exists such an Īśvara, say the Pashupatas and Vaisheshikas. The Pashupati are Shaiva, followers of Lord Shiva, and the Vaisheshikas are one of the 6 schools that I mentioned, right? Vedanta, Mimamsa, Yoga, Sāṅkhya, Nyaya, logicians coming up next week, and Vaisheshika that we're not going to deal with. So he's here, seems to be, and the Pashupatis were devotees of Shiva, but they adopted a Vaisheshika metaphysics. I don't want to get too much into the metaphysics of Vaisheshika. But now the Yuktitipika is saying that these Pashupatis and Vaisheshika, others obviously were Īśvara followers at the time, that this is probably written in the 5th century, but for some reason, the author of the Yuktitipika picks out the Pashupatas and Vaisheshikas as accepting the existence of an Īśvara. So they say there's an Īśvara, and for what reason do they give? So now he's going to present the Īśvara arguments. So these Īśvara followers, the Pashupatas and the Vaisheshikas, say, because a special product has a superior intelligence as a cause. If something's produced, someone must have produced it, right? This didn't just sort of assemble as a product made of parts. Someone must have produced it, right? Old arguments, we've seen them before. Hence, in this world, so you have to give an example of that in your, in your frame of reference, in the world that we perceive, in the world that we know, you have to give an example of this principle that a product is made or produced by a producer. So in this world, a special product, such as a palace or a chariot, is observed to have a superior intelligence as a cause. There's an intelligent being that makes the palace and chariot. Remember, this is not his argument. He's introducing the opponent's argument. Then he's going to respond and say, no, 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 we reject it. But first, what's the argument he's going to reject? Well, the opponent says that products, palaces, chariots, they need intelligence as a cause. And there is a special product, meaning the world. That's a special product, right? Why is it special? Because it's huge. It's not like a little palace or a chariot. So it's special in its enormity and its infinite complexity. So there is a special product characterized through arrangements such as elements. What is involved in the creation of the world? Well, elements, atoms, subatomic particles, forces, sense organs, living creatures with senses, and living creatures. So that's the opponent. Hence, it also must have a superior intelligence as cause, just like a chariot or a palace does. Well, this world must have, by the same principle. And he who is this cause is Īśvara. Hence, there exists Īśvara, says the opponent. And besides, there's another argument. because the conjunction of a conscious being with a non-conscious being is affected by a conscious being. So when you take a conscious being and you connect it with a non-conscious being, it's going to give an example. It's a conscious being that makes that connection. For example, the conjunction of ox and cart. The cart is unconscious, ox is conscious. So who brings them together? They don't just sort of, the ox doesn't randomly just harness itself on a cart. No, a conscious being brings together unconscious and conscious being, right? And he's going to say the world is unconscious. The souls are the Īśvara argument is the world is unconscious, like the cart. The living entities, the trillions of Purushas are conscious like the ox, but someone has to bring them together, has to be an Īśvara, an intelligence. So that's the point of the example. Just as in our small little frame of reference, a little thing like a cart and a little conscious being like an ox, a more intelligent being has to bring them together. So it is with the world of matter and souls. And there is such a conjunction of conscious and non-conscious beings, namely the soul and the body. Who brings them together? Hence, it should be affected by a conscious being in the same way. There must be intelligence that brings together the Atmans, the souls, into their bodies and in the world. He by whom it is affected is Īśvara. So the opponents say, let's call him Īśvara. Hence, there exists Īśvara as cause of the visible universe. So now he's presented the Purva Paksha, the opposing point of view. We're familiar with this by now. If not, let's get familiar with it. We're going to encounter it again in Nyaya next week. Now, our answer is, now, Yukta Deepika is going to reject this. With regard to your statement that the existence of Īśvara is proved on the account of the fact that a special product has as cause a superior intelligence, you want to say the special product of the world, like the little products we know, you want to say there's a special product, this huge entire universe has as cause a superior intelligence. We say no. We reply no. Why? Why do you say no? Because it is to be proved. You haven't proved it. Well, you can prove that a chariot is made by an intelligence being, and you can prove that, this is made by an intelligence being. But why do you jump, make this enormous jump that therefore the universe is created by an intelligent being? The Yukta Deepika says, no, we don't. Where's the proof of that? It is to be proved. It's not yet been proved. You haven't proved it. You just asserted it. It is to be proved where the palace have as cause only intelligent beings like us, or have as cause a superior intelligence. Hence, it is no answer, right? Fine, you can say a palace, etc., has a little being, an intelligent being. Well, why do you jump to the super being then? What if it's just all the souls with it, caused the activation of Prakriti and creation emerges? What if the souls are the catalyst? That's what Sāṅkhya says. The souls, even though they're inactive, by their nature, they're like a magnet. And if you put iron filings near the magnet doesn't do anything, but it makes change. It makes movement in the iron filings. So why do you have to posit some super intelligence? Just maybe the souls are the activators, the triggers of creation. So that's his first argument. Further, because there is no intellect, buddhi, prior to the activity of the prime matter, pradhana. Remember, pradhana is matter, and intelligence is part of matter. Remember, the soul is only consciousness. It's not thinking. In Sāṅkhya and Vedanta, it's not thought, the mind, cognition, intellectuality, ratiocination, intellectual activity. That's all part of the mind, which is made of the three gunas. Sattva is made of matter, very subtle matter. It's like a sheath enveloping consciousness. So the soul, the Atman, has a gross body, the physical body we see, has a subtle body, a psychic body. But both bodies are actually made of the gunas. It's just the gross body is made of more dense gunas, tamas, dense matter. And the mind, the subtle body, is made of more subtle matter. Okay? But intellect is a product of creation. That's the point. So before creation, there's no intellect with which to create. That's the argument. Intelligent comes post the subtle matter, material from which intelligence is made. Right? Nowadays they talk about neurons or whatever it is, but it's still matter. They didn't exist. There was no matter before creation, so there was no intelligence then to direct it. That's the argument. Because there's no intellect, buddhi, prior to the activity of the prime matter, the pradhana. since all other causes is excluded, the special product, which has an intelligent cause, you're saying that this special product, this universe, which has an intelligent cause, would have to be produced from the prime matter. You say creation comes from pradhana, but we hold that prior to the evolution of prime matter, there's no intellect at all. You can't have an intelligent being because intelligence hasn't been created yet. So you want to say that this creation requires an intelligence being to mastermind creation, where we say that very intelligence itself that you want to posit is in the supreme being. We say that hasn't come in, that itself hasn't been created yet because it's part of creation. Creation isn't just gross matter, atoms and particles and gravity. It's also psychic matter, like intelligence. Now, so that's his first response. And then he says, okay, well, maybe in response, you will say, maybe you'll counter response. So if you say, on account of the possession of special powers, the intellect comes into being in the case of the superior intelligent being of its own self. If you say that, well, this being is different and it makes its own intelligence before creation, it doesn't, you know, so therefore it's a special sort of being. Unlike us little being, the souls, we're injected into property, and then we get our bodies and psychic bodies according to karma, right? We get them after we enter into creation. After the souls are, you know, when you reincarnate, you get a gross body and the subtle body after one is injected. But if you want to say that God's different from that, God's a special case. He doesn't get his intelligence after creation. He already has it, or he wills it prior to creation. If you say something like that, then the Yuktadipika gets a bit sarcastic here. Perhaps you mean this. He clearly doesn't think it's a good argument. Īśvara is endowed with omnipotence up before creation. Īśvara is omnipotent. And if he's omnipotent, there's therefore, being omnipotent, no contradiction in the fact that intellect is present in him even prior to the evolution of the prime matter, of its own self, through his own will. So before creation, Īśvara, being omnipotent, manifests his own intelligence. He doesn't need the intelligence of matter, the psychic intelligence that comes post-creation, right? Creation, subtle things are created, gross things are created. Those things are like earth, water, fire, right? Air is more subtle, mind is more subtle, intellect is more subtle, but it's all prakriti, it's all pradhana, it's all the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And then the Purusha is just pure consciousness. So if Īśvara is a Purusha, the first argument was he has no intelligence. Intelligence is a product of creation. It's like he has no body, because bodies are products of creation. So that's his first argument. Then he says, and he predicts, well, you might then say, well, Īśvara is special, omnipotent, can manifest his own intelligence through his will. Icha, that's what it means to be omnipotent. Anything you will, you can make happen. That's the meaning of omnipotent, omnipotency. You have all potencies to do anything. But what if you say that? Well, also this cannot be accepted. Well, we don't accept that either. Why? Because there's no example. What example do you have? You're just making stuff up. What example have you for it? That the intellect comes into existence of its own self. We don't have an example. You gave us an example of a palace and then said, well, it has a creator. And therefore, this world is like a very complicated palace. It needs a super creator. Well, you gave us an example. Well, what example do you have of someone making up their own intelligence, of an Atman, even a supreme Atman, a supreme conscious being, just making his own intelligence? What example have you for it? You gave us an example of the palace, fine. Where's your example do you have of the being doing that? That the intellect comes into existence of its own self prior to creation. If you ask for one, if we ask, we're going to ask you, well, what example? Give us an example. What can you tell us? Hence, it's not correct. You have no answer. Now he's predicting a counter argument. That's how it goes back and forth. The school engages an opposing point of view and say, if you say that, we say this, and then okay, and if you say this, if you say A, we respond A plus. If you then change your position or adjust it and say B, well, we respond B plus. And if you then change it again and say C, well, then we respond with C plus. And that's how Indian discussions take place. It's very healthy and intellectually sort of open and non-dogmatic. Now, if you would say, third round, there is no fault in this. Opposition, we're going to defend opposition. Why? On account of the peculiar powers of Īśvara. Īśvara has special powers. And he goes, perhaps you mean, he say, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Maybe you mean this. The other intelligent beings do not possess power similar to that of Īśvara. The little souls, you and I, we don't possess that kind of power. We're injected in creation, and then we get our psychic body, we get intelligence after creation, because intelligence is a product of creation, product of the gunas. It's a subtle property. We get that, and the gross bodies after creation. That's us. But Īśvara is different. If you say that, Īśvara does not like the little souls. Īśvara, manifests his own intelligence, can do that before creation. If you say something like that, right? And the other intelligent beings like you and I, the Atmans, do not possess power similar to that of Īśvara. Hence, in their case, in our case, intellects arise from the prime matter, right? For us, we get our intellect after we enter into creation, either simultaneously with the dispositions of the parts of the body, or through the contact with the soul. Don't worry about that. In other words, we get our intellect, our karma, pushes us into samsara, and we come in contact with elements that make our body and the psychic entities that make up our minds. If you say that, but if you say that, but you continue to say the intellect of Īśvara comes into being of its own self, you might want to say something like that then. But for us, yes, our intelligence is post-creation, but Īśvara is different. You want to say that? Well, this is what we say. This too cannot be accepted. We reject that as well. Why? Because they would follow the possibility of proving any doctrine. Then you could just say anything. That's not philosophy anymore. If you just say the cause has some mystic magical power that's different from everything known, well, then you might as well say the cause is a Martian sitting on a cloud, sitting on Mars with a banjo. You could say anything and just say, well, it's just this magic power, a special power of the cause. You could say God is anything you want, an extraterrestrial with frog's eyes, playing a piano. If you want to start saying, well, it's special, then that's not philosophy anymore. Then there's no more reason and argument. Your cause and effect, it has to fit in with the principles of cause and effect. So then you can prove anything. Then you can prove any doctrine. We're not talking philosophy anymore. If you just say, well, it's just the way it is, and this cause has special powers different from everything else, that's not philosophy. It's dogma. If one declares that he who brings forward a case contrary to the example of the proof, right? All men are mortal, just like Socrates is a man. So that's your proof, right? Smoke is always, let's use the Indian example. Wherever there's smoke, there's fire, like in a kitchen. In a kitchen, there's smoke. In a village kitchen where you use, open fire with made of cow dung. Cow dung is used for fuel still today all over rural India. So you say, wherever there's smoke in the fire, and you give an example from our known world, like in a rural kitchen, there's smoke and then there's fire, right? Or all products have a producer like this, like a palace, like a chariot that we read in the previous verse, or like this. So there's examples that we know, and then you say, and then you make your case. Therefore, anything that's produced like the universe also has a producer. But if you bring forward a case contrary to the example of the proof, your proof is that products need a producer, but the producers have to use intelligence. And intelligence is something you get after creation. But now you want to say that, well, they're except for God, who has an intelligence before creation, you've got no proof for that. And then without a proof, you can't have logic. The laws of logic then are disrespected. You can't have a philosophical exchange. Okay, so you can't just bring in some random, it's, this causes magic and doesn't follow any of the rules. Then that's not science. It's not logic. So if you bring forward a case contrary to the example of the proof and makes objection, you should keep in mind that there is, in the case in question, a special power. This is just mere supposition. This is just a dogmatic statement. We got no proof of a being creating its own intelligence prior to the creation of matter. There is no intelligence. You want to say Īśvara has such an intelligence prior? There's no proof of that. Okay, that's the argument. Thus, if the intellect of Īśvara cannot come into existence of itself, right? Then it is right to say that on account of the absence, sorry, give me a second. I'm just going to get make sure that, where do we get forward? Oh, whoa, oh, we're moving along. Okay. Thus, if the intellect of Īśvara cannot come into existence of itself, then it is right to say that on account of the absence of intellects prior to the activity of the prime matter, this special product does not have an intelligent being as a cause. That's the Yuktadipika's position. Now he's giving his position, the author of the Yuktadipika. He's saying, look, the intellect of Īśvara cannot come into existence by itself. It can't just magically will it prior to matter. Then, if we accept our view that intellect can't come into existence before there's been creation, then it's right to say, as we say, that because there's no intellect prior to the activity, the creative activity of prime matter, pradhana, prior to that creative activity, there's no intellect, then this special product, meaning the universe, does not have an intelligent being as cause. There's no Īśvara. There's no special, there's not have an intelligent being as cause Īśvara. Okay? I hope you're following along, and that's not too hard. Further, now he's going to give another argument. It's not fitting, meaning it's wrong to say, that Īśvara acts in view of a fruit. Now we're back to the old argument. Why does Īśvara create? First of all, he's given that. The first argument is, you want to say that this, like all products, require an intelligent maker. The world as a product requires a super creator, but to create, you need intelligence. Okay, I'm repeating the argument. Let's make sure it's clear. A producer, when he makes a product or she makes a product, uses intelligence to make the product. You need intelligence to build a palace. And you want to say, in the same way, the world is a product. It must be intelligent. We say intelligence doesn't exist before the creation. There may be consciousness. Consciousness is eternal. Sāṅkhya accepts. The soul is eternal. The Atman is eternal. But the Atman is just consciousness. It doesn't have intelligence until it's united with Prakriti, and then it gets a subtle psychic body, which is the intelligent body of intelligence, and then the gross body. So therefore, we say your own example backfires on you because your producer of the palace received the intelligence to make the palace after creation, received a psychic body, an intellectual body, a thinking and rational body, receives that post-creation. So you can't. So your example of that Īśvara must be like that. But you're saying Īśvara is like that. On the one hand, you're saying Īśvara is like the producer of the product, but then you're saying, well, actually, Īśvara is different because he just makes his own intelligence. So your example fails. Your very example fails because now you're introducing something. Īśvara's magically produced intelligence, which is not in the example you give of the product, the palaces and the chariot. Now he moves on to another argument, which we've encountered before. Why would Īśvara want to do all of this? Further, it's not fitting that Īśvara acts in view of fruit. Fruit means you want something, a desire, right? Yeah, you build a palace because you want to live in it. You want to display your power. So that's the fruit. Fruit meaning you're without a reason. It's not fitting that Īśvara acts in view of a fruit. Intelligent beings, right now you give us the example of the king building a palace, chariot maker building a chariot. Those intelligent beings are observed to construct special products like palace, chariot, etc., with a view to visible or invisible fruit. You want a visible fruit, you want to live in it, or invisible. Maybe you want fame, that's invisible, or you want honor, or you want prestige. But this is vitiated. But this doesn't work. It's vitiated by the fact of the supreme power of Īśvara. What fruit does Īśvara want? Īśvara is supposed to be self-contained. It's the old argument we encountered already. Further, there's no director possible Intelligent beings are observed to construct special products like chariots and palaces under the direction of another. So the palace builder is directed by the engineer. Chariot build is directed by whatever. But this is not possible in the case of Īśvara, since it's impossible that there is anyone superior to him. I don't think that's a very good argument, because you could just say, well, somebody building the palace has to be some ultimate engineer. So I'm not sure that's a great argument, but let's read on. Further, because your argument, right, those who are theists, the Īśvara people, your argument is not absolutely conclusive. For not every special product has an intelligent cause. Maybe palaces and chariots do, but what about trees? Trees, etc., come into being without it. They come into being just because the living, Sāṅkhya is going to say, because the living entities get injected into Prakriti, and then their karma connects them with bodies like that of a tree or an animal or a human. It's just the law of karma is sufficient. We don't need some grand intellectual intelligence, Īśvara. So trees, etc., come into being without a super intelligence. On the assumption that everything has the intellect of Īśvara as the cause, there's no example. No, you can't show an example of everything having Īśvara as a cause. Trees don't. We don't see any Īśvara. We just see living entities injected into the trees. And there cannot be an argument without an example. You can't make an argument in Indian philosophy without an argument, without an example. So you say, wherever there is smoke, there's fire. You have to give an example, like in the kitchen in a rustic, in a rural home. Or, if you took the Greek, all men are mortal, like Socrates. You have to give an example. That's not quite the way the Greek syllogism works, but I'm just appropriating it. But we don't see any example of Īśvara, being behind, we don't, the production of the trees, the intelligent Īśvara. Hence, on account of the lack of absolute conclusiveness, we don't see it, he's saying. You can't conclude. The perceptible world does not have an intelligent being as its cause. We don't see that anything like that. We just see that, living entities get injected into Prakriti, bodies form around them like trees, and that's what we see. We don't see, you can't give us any proof of anything more than that. Let's keep going. Further, an intelligent being is not the cause. Now they're going to give their arguments. Because of, back to the old arguments, the predominance of pain in the world. Why is there suffering? My friends, this is the biggest argument, not just amongst the Indian atheists, but Western atheism too. Even the new atheists today, Richard Dorff, the new atheists, it's one of the big arguments. What kind of a God is this? Look at all the horror, brutality, slaughter, and suffering in the world. How can you possibly imagine there's a benevolent being behind that? Same thing. There's a predominance of pain, suffering. If this special product, remember the special product is the world, right? Because the theists say, look, all products have a producer, like chariots and palaces, and the world is a special product. And why is it special? Because obviously it's huge and it's enormous. So wherever it says special product, it means, well, this special product, if it had an intelligence as cause, its maker would not have had any purpose in creating an excess of pain. Why would a maker make a world full of this horrible pain? And since he's said to be all powerful, he would have created the world with more happiness and pain. This is the theodicy problem of Western philosophy. Christians have had to face this for centuries. You want to say God is benevolent, number one. You want to say God is omnipotent, number two. Why is there suffering? If God is benevolent, he wouldn't want it suffering. And if he's omnipotent, he could make it stop. And of course, then usually arguments revolve around the existence of free will. I know we've discussed it before. There's no harm repeating these arguments, my friends, because I know we're cramming a lot into this course. Same, it's called the theodicy problem. Look it up in Wiki. Theodicy, Theodicy. So if he's omnipotent, all powerful, he would have created the world with more happiness and pain. But this special product, remember, meaning the world, has a predominance of pain. There's more suffering than happiness. Look in the world, our own world. Look at all those people suffering in Syria and, and in all the war zones. How many wars are there? And you know, people get old and diseased, even in prosperous countries of so much suffering. Therefore, because there's suffering, it is not a special product having an intelligent cause. And any intelligent super cause, super intelligent cause wouldn't make a world of pain. Further, an intelligent being is not the cause. Again, there is no Īśvara, we say, and now we're giving another argument, right? When it says an intelligent being is not the cause, he's saying we reject the idea of Īśvara. Īśvara, remember, being defined as the intelligent being behind creation. Another argument now. Further, we reject Īśvara. Why? Because of the difficulty of attaining one's aim. If this special product had an intelligent cause, this is not a very good argument. The attainment of religious merit, dharma, these are the goals of life, you know, being righteous, wealth, pleasure, liberation would be easy. If that, you know, if there had been an intelligent being, it would have made it easier for us to be righteous, to accumulate wealth, to pursue pleasure, and to get liberated. But they're very difficult to attain. It's difficult to attain these things. Difficult to be a good person, right? Sometimes you have to struggle. Difficult to accumulate wealth. Difficult to, you know, we seek pleasure. Occasionally we find moments of pleasure, but for most part, we're often disappointed. And then liberation at the end of it is difficult. Hence, this special product, namely the world, has no cause, has not for cause an intelligent being. There is no Īśvara. Īśvara wouldn't have made it so hard. Now, if you would say, if you, Īśvara believers, are going to respond to that argument by saying the preponderance of pain and difficulty of attaining human ends is no fault of Īśvara, because dharma and adharma, right, morality, are the cause of it. You know, you're free, the living entities are free, and they can be good or bad. And then if they're good, they'll be happy. They'll get these four things. They'll be righteous, they'll get wealth, they get pleasure, they get liberation. So Īśvara allows them to be free. But perhaps you mean by this, he's not very impressed with that argument, and he rewords it. Perhaps you mean, even though this special product, this world, has Īśvara for its cause, yet through the acquirement of merit and demerit, right? If you're moral, you get good things. If you're not moral, you get bad things. By living beings like us, who were created at the time of the first creation with a preponderance of happiness. So he's saying, if you say, well, in the beginning, everybody was happy, the world was a nice place, it was created full of happiness, and then the living entities have free will, right? God's not going to force them, otherwise they'd be machines, right? They would have no choice. They'd be like a machine then. They'd just be programmed to act a certain way. So you want to have free will. In the beginning, they're all happy, and then they got to choose to be good or bad, and then some of them were bad, and therefore they end up getting bad results, and therefore they suffer. If you want to say that, there results the association of living beings with lower, middle, and superior grades of and if you say, and as a result, we get lower, middle, and superior grades of age, caste, and character. In other words, beings are born in different families, some in animal bodies, some in good bodies, some in bad bodies, in different ages, different castes. If you say all that, and therefore this is no fault of Īśvara, if your response is don't blame Īśvara for suffering in the world, it's the activities of the living beings, and they get their appropriate results in the form of good bodies or bad bodies, etc. Like Patanjali says, what do we say? We say this is also not right. Why do we say that? Because there's no reason for the origination of demerit. Why would there in the beginning be a dharma? Why would there be evil or bad things in the beginning? Why would there be even a choice in the beginning? There would just be good things. Demerit, in other words, adharma in Sanskrit, actions against the righteous moral code of the Vedic India. If Īśvara had dominion, if he had power over merit and demerit, right? In Sanskrit, dharma and adharma, get used to those terms, my friends. You're going to meet them in the Gita. Dharma is when you do your duties righteously and according to the law. So if you're a husband, you're a good husband. Your wife, you're a good husband. That's dharma. People have many dharmas, right? You have a dharma to your kids. You have a different dharma to your parents. You have a different dharma to your siblings. You have a professional dharma. You have all these dharmas. And if you do them in the correct way, according to the high principles of civilization, that's called, you get merit. And if you don't, if you're a bad husband, abusive father, whatever it might be, you get demerits. So he's saying, so the opponent, right, the Īśvara people say, so because they have free will, they get to choose if they want to be meritus or not. If you see it, right? But if Īśvara had, now his answer is, Yuktadipika author answer is, if Īśvara had dominion over merit and demerit, he would have brought into existence only merit. If he's kind, he would have just had merit. He would have sort of programmed things so that only meritorious activity. Of course, the opponent's going to say, well, then there's no free will then. Free will means you have to have a choice. Otherwise, you're just a machine. You're pre-programmed to be good, like a robot. But if you're free, then there has to be that choice. So that's the argument, same argument the Christians would give. So he would have brought into existence only merit, that alone being for the living beings the cause of happiness, but no demerit. He wouldn't have brought demeriting. Why? Because there being no use of it. It only makes living beings suffer. So Īśvara wouldn't, why would he even had demerit as an option? But if it be supposed that merit and demerit originate from their causes naturally, if you say, well, look, that's just the law of karma. The dharma of the universe is set up that way naturally, without the activity of an intelligent being. If you say, well, Īśvara's got nothing to do with it, that's just the law, that's the way things are set up, well, then there arises a contradiction. Then you get yourself into a quandary if you say that. Because you're contradicting yourself that every evolved being has for its cause the intelligence of Īśvara. Because you want to say, on the one hand, everything that's produced has Īśvara as the cause, and then you say, well, karma is an exception. Karma just operates a dharma and adharma, the principle of the law of the universe, that merit brings good results and demerit brings bad results, and that's karma, the law of karma. And you want to say, well, Īśvara's got nothing to do with that. Well, you just contradicted yourself. You just said Īśvara is responsible for everything. In which case, Īśvara is not the cause of the visible universe. What you need, and if you even, and the second problem, if you say that, is what do you need an Īśvara for? Let karma be the supreme guiding causal power. Why do you need an Īśvara then, if you're going to say karma operates independently from Īśvara? What else is the Yuktadipika going to say in his arguments against the theists? And with regard to what has been said by you, right, the theist, namely that Īśvara exists. Why? Let me see if we want to read this one. Yes, we're going to read it. We're going to go on to up to page 143. So we're on 139. So 4 more pages, my friends. And let's see how long it takes us. And with regard to what has been said by you, namely that Īśvara exists. Why? Because the conjunction of a conscious being with a non-conscious being is affected by a conscious being. We reply. He introduced that argument earlier, that the ox and the cart. So the ox is conscious, the cart is unconscious. But the two, how are they brought together? You need a conscious being to bring another conscious being, the ox, into connection, harnessing, yoking with an unconscious thing, the cart. So a conscious being who is connected with an unconscious being, another conscious being has to bring the two together. If you say that, we reply, this is wrong. Yeah, it is wrong. Why is it wrong? It has to be proved. You haven't proven it. By which conscious being is affected this conjunction of conscious and non-conscious beings, such as ox and cart? Who is the conscious being that brings the ox and the cart together? Of course, the answer is a farmer. By what wonder is the conjunction of this body said to be affected by a conscious being? What makes you say that the soul, when it, right, the ox and the cart is an example for a larger thing, which is the soul and the body? You say the ox and the cart has to be brought together by a farmer or somebody else, another intelligent being, and the same applies for the conjunction or the coming together of the soul and the body, the Atman and the body. Well, we challenge that, but he hasn't given a reason why. Okay, let's read on. And if you would say the soul, who is the director, upadrashta, of the body, and who is designated by us by the name Chaitra. Chaitra means any person, right? It's the soul who directs the body that we call Kshetra and is acknowledged as the producer of it. If you say that, the soul is the director of the body, we answer, this is not right, since it's to be proved. For the agency of the soul is not admitted by us. We don't accept that the soul is an agent. We don't accept that there is free will in the soul. And so you want to say that the soul is the agent. You know what, let's skip this. This is taking us a little bit further. I don't think this is a great argument. Let's skip down, my friends, because I don't want to be too. I don't want this to be too difficult or complicated. So if you would say, let's go down to here. No, I don't think so. Well, it's a body argument. Let's have a look. Let's see how we do it. I think this may be the last argument. Right. So if you say, the argument is if Īśvara doesn't have a body, it's just consciousness, how is he going to create? Because to create something, matter has to come into contact with matter, right? So I want to move this, so my material hand has to push it. But if Īśvara has no body before creation, how can he come into contact with the atoms that form creation? So that's going to lie at the base of these arguments. So if you say this, Īśvara possesses, so we're now going to go down to here. Īśvara possesses body and it has intelligence. So also is Īśvara. Hence, you cannot bring forward as a counterexample for the case of the conjunction of a conscious being with an unconscious being. So in other words, we say the opponent, the theists say, Īśvara possesses a body and therefore he can use that body to enact creation. We answer, this is not right. Why? Because it would follow that there is no conjunction between them. There is no conjunction of one soul with another soul, although they do not differ in being conscious. In the same way, there would be no conjunction between Īśvara and his body, but this is not acceptable to you. Okay, if you would say that, okay, but that for creation, Īśvara has to have a body to create in order to connect with the atoms. But what if his body is made of matter? Well, matter hasn't been created yet. So how can you have a material body? Now, if you respond to that and say, well, actually, his body his spirit is consciousness. So now you have Īśvara as a conscious entity inside a body that is made of consciousness. There's no conjunction between them, just like between one atma and another. They can't come up against each other. Consciousness cannot contact consciousness. So if you want to say that, okay, fine, Īśvara's body is not material because matter hasn't been created yet. Īśvara has a body made of consciousness, and Īśvara is the conscious super Atman inside a body made of consciousness. We say there's no conjunction. They can't come in connection with each other. And I think we better skip these because they would. Now, if you say no, down here, if you would say, well, if that's the case, both are not conscious. The body of God is not conscious, for we do not admit that Īśvara is a body. If you say, well, actually, we don't accept that Īśvara has a body in the first place, there is no fault in our doctrine. So therefore, where opposition holds good, Īśvara is just pure intelligence. He doesn't need a body. Those who acknowledge the substance called Īśvara teach that now. Notice the Yukta Deepika is going to quote sacred text. It says, wait a minute, your scriptures say that Īśvara is a body. Right? Do you see the problem with the body? Here's the argument. The argument is, for God to create, he has to have a body. Because otherwise, how can he come into contact with matter? He has to come into contact with matter to push it out, to create it, right? consciousness cannot contact matter. It just pervades it. It can't push it and make it act and move. So therefore, God needs to have a body. If the body's material, that's nonsensical because matter hasn't been created yet. So how can God have a material body before matter's been created? So we can't have a material body. If, on the other hand, you say, the Yukta Deepika, right, arguing against the opponent. If, on the other hand, you say, okay, fine, God's body is not material, it's consciousness, that makes some sense because you have a conscious Īśvara as kind of like a super soul, like we have our soul in our physical body, and our soul is the director of our physical body. If you want to say God has a body, but and it's not material like ours, what's it made of then? Well, it's made of consciousness. Well, consciousness cannot connect with consciousness. How would the two? It would just be like air meeting air; they just merge, or light meeting light, or something. How would one consciousness kind of impact the consciousness in the body, impact the consciousness that is the body? It makes no sense. And if you say, well, fine, if you say, well, okay, that we accept that's a problem, but we don't say that God has a body in the first place. And therefore, what do we say? The opponent says, well, this substance called Īśvara, substance, an entity, teach that he's possessed of infinite marks, he's all pervasive, he's devoid of parts, there's no parts, because if something has parts, you can pull them pull apart, separate the parts, and that thing doesn't exist anymore. Infinite power, subtlest amongst the subtle, biggest amongst the big, subject of merit, eternal, etc. Why should one attach a body and falsely attribute it to him? If you say that, God doesn't have a body, he's all pervasive, he's subtle, he's in infinite power, he's devoid of parts. If you say all of these things, we answer, this too is not correct. Why? Because it contradicts your own argument. If Īśvara is such bodiless, then your argument that Īśvara exists because a special product has a superior intelligence as cause, going back to the original argument, special product, the world has a superior intelligence, and the argument you give is the conjunction of a conscious being with a non-conscious being, ox and the cart, is affected by a conscious being. It's contradicted. Why? Because so far has not been observed such a bodiless being having such activity. We haven't seen a bodiless being bringing a ox and a cart together. If you want to use that as an example, that you need just as the conscious ox and the unconscious cart, they need a farmer, a conscious being to bring them together. And then you want to extend that to the universe and say the souls and the world are brought together by Īśvara. But the example of the farmer is a body. We've never seen a bodiless entity bringing together a inanimate and animate thing like an ox and a cart. We've never seen a bodiless entity do something like that. Because so far has not been observed such a bodiless being having such activity, namely affecting special products or conjoining conscious beings with non-conscious beings. We've never seen a bodiless being doing stuff like that, bringing animate and inanimate entities together. Okay. And onward we go. Or if this be admitted, if you say, okay, that Īśvara has no body, then the assuming of a form by Īśvara would be contradicted. In Hinduism, Shiva, Vishnu, Īśvara manifests a form and enters into the world. Krishna, we're going to find later, speaks the Bhagavad Gita, and he's situated on the battlefield in a beautiful blue form, right? So if you, then what are you going to, then if you say he has no body, what are you going to, it says the Yukta Deepika. Now you want to suddenly change your position and say, okay, God has no body. We realize the difficulty with that. He can't have a material body because matter hasn't been created. He can't have a spiritual body because what does that mean? How is spirit going to somehow impact matter? Of course, the theist would say, well, it can. But just, God can have a conscious body and full of all power and do anything. But let's stick with the arguments. But if you want to say all that, then what are you going to do with all of your scriptures that talk about God as, incarnation, avatara, God assuming a form? If Īśvara is absolutely has a bodiless form, then the assuming of bodily form out of earth, etc., would be contradicted. Your texts talk about Īśvara assuming a form. So you're contradicting your own spiritual text. And he goes on with the same thing. There is another reason, because of revelation, the scriptures. Revelation 2 declares that he has a body. Like this is Shiva, covered with a skin. Shiva wears, he's an ascetic. He's in the Himalayas, meditating on his own internal bliss. With a hand holding the Pinaka bowl. So you've seen, perhaps you can go online and look at pictures of Shiva. Sometimes he's holding the Pinaka bowl. Having his bow drawn to full stretch, having black tufts of hair. These are quotes from scriptures about Īśvara's body. So he's saying, your very scriptures talk about Īśvara having a body. Are you going to contradict those? All right. If you would say, I think this is our last one. By accepting these references, these appellations of Īśvara to be true, so now the opponent says, okay, you're quoting the scripture saying that God has a form to argue against us. But does that mean you accept God as a form? You, Yukta Deepika author? If you're bringing in this scripture with the references to God having a form to argue against us, well, does that mean you, the Yukta Deepika author, accept that God is a form? If you would say by accepting these appellations of Krishna to be true, your own assertion, namely that there is no Īśvara, would be contradicted, probably you mean. If you're going to say, okay, then you, Yukta Deepika, are quoting scripture, asserting God as a form, then that means you accept God has a form. Probably you mean, if on account of the words of revelation, the scripture, and Īśvara possessing a bodily form would be accepted, therefore his existence is proved. Why? Because that which is not existent cannot possess a bodily form. If you say, you're going to quote the scriptures, and remember, Sāṅkhya does accept the Vedic scriptures, if on account of the words of the scriptures, Īśvara possessing a bodily form, that we have to accept that God has a form, and therefore he exists. Why? Because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't have a form. And if you accept these references to form, that God has a form, you're thereby accepting that there is a God. So why are you arguing against, against Īśvara in the first place? We answer, what is the Yukta Deepika answer? Remember, if you would say means the opposing point of view. And we answer is all the way through. What do we answer to that? This too is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because you do not understand our view. You misunderstand our view. We do not absolutely object to the special power of a divine being. So just like the Jains, Sāṅkhya also accepts that there are super normal, super beings, celestials, great sages. Remember the Jains with the Tirthankaras? What they reject is the notion of one absolute and ultimate Īśvara supreme being. They don't reject the fact that there are beings who are more, who are more powerful than we are. So Sāṅkhya accepts there are different dimensions, there's celestial beings, and that so Sāṅkhya would say Shiva and these references in the scripture are just super beings and not Īśvara in the sense of God with a big G. Just like the Jains. Remember Professor Lung's lecture? He's saying, what do we mean by theism and atheism? If you mean one supreme causal agent, Īśvara, then the Jains are atheists. But if you mean, well, are there supernatural beings with superpowers and celestial type beings? Yes, they accept those. So does that make them theists or atheists? Sāṅkhya is the same kind of thing. They accept, higher order beings that have more potencies and powers than we do. So we do not absolutely object to the special power of a divine being. We admit the existence of glorious bodies, celestial beings, but not of one ultimate causal being who is the creator. These beings are not creators, they're just powerful entities. Our opinion is this, that there is no such mover distinct from the prime matter and the soul. In other words, we accept celestial beings, but they have bodies. They're in prime matter, but they just have more subtle bodies. We don't accept there's one outside of Prakriti who is the original creator. That we don't accept, but we do accept super normal beings, and that's how we read the Yuktadipika author. That's how he reads these references to Krishna and Shiva and Vishnu in the sacred texts. So we don't. Our opinion is this: we accept beings with special power, the divine beings, but no such one solitary, one mover distinct from prime matter and the soul. We don't accept that. All embodied, all even supernatural beings have bodies and are, subject to the laws of property. Hence, okay, hence the conjunction of prime matter and soul is not affected through another third being like Īśvara. That's their position. And all right, so I think that's good enough. I don't want to, it's only 1 hour and 1 minute. We'll read a couple more, and normally in class you leave time at the end for questions. Let me just read the last little one that we'll read together. Last two arguments. Further, the conjunction of prime matter and soul by Īśvara is impossible. Why? Because a conjunction is made for the sake of another. You bring them together for the sake of someone else. It is observed that the conjunction of an ox and a cart is made for the sake of another. But the conjunction of prime matter and soul is not for the sake of another. What? Right? Who are you bringing? For whom are you bringing this? Are you conjoining prime matter and the soul? If you would say it's for the sake of Īśvara, we answer no, because it has already been said. It had been said already at the beginning that it's impossible for Īśvara to have a purpose, visible or invisible. God is self-content, self-satisfied. What purpose would he have to bring about creation? Okay, so that's it. So the main arguments then, right? The opponent wants to say all products like a palace and a chariot have an intelligent cause, and the universe is a special case of that. It is a product, but because it's far more complicated than a palace or a chariot, then the maker of it must be far more omniscient, far greater intelligence, and therefore we consider that created to be omniscient and omnipotent, right? Because you create a palace, you have to have a certain amount of intelligence, certain amount of power, know a certain amount of things to put it all together. Well, if that's the case of the palace, then extend that infinitely, given the complexity of the universe, then the maker of that special product has to be infinitely knowledgeable and infinitely powerful. We call that omniscient, omnipotent. So that's the argument. Response is, and the second argument of the theist is, and who brings together the conscious and unconscious? Who brought the ox and the cart together? There has to be a third intelligent being, right? So who brings the souls and the world together? There has to be an Īśvara. And we say, and so the answer is, well, we don't see. Fine, we see the producer of the palace and the chariot, but we don't see some omniscient being making the universe. So it's yet to be proved. Your little example, you can't just jump from the fact that a palace has a maker and a chariot has a maker. You make this enormous jump. Therefore, the universe has a maker. That's not a legitimate jump. We have no example of that. We don't perceive that. Okay, so that seems to be the basic argument. And then of course, why would he do it anyway, even if there were a creator, or what would be the motive? And then of course we see many things that don't have creators, like trees and mountains. Maybe a palace and you've just selected a couple of obvious examples, like the palace and the ox cart. But what about all the other things that we don't see producers for? Fine, we see makers, intelligent makers for palaces and ox cart, but we don't see that for trees and mountains and rivers and so forth. So you've overextended your example, and you can't just use that then to sort of posit that there must be a creator for the whole universe. All right, and those are the basic arguments. And why is there pain and suffering in the world? We've had that repeated several times. I'm sure that will be on the quiz. You know, we won't bring in any very difficult questions on the quiz. But hopefully you get the basic questions. And this argument of palaces and design is essentially intelligent design argument. We're going to meet that again next week when we go back to that book, God in Indian Philosophy, Professor Dusty, and we'll look at that argument developed from the Nyaya school that products have to have creators. We're going to visit that again before the next quiz, so you'll have a second round of engaging that very argument. It's the main argument from the theists, as it is with Christians today. It's called intelligent design. That there has to be, that the world is so meticulously, it's actually the fine-tuning argument is the best expression of that argument. That the universe is so incredibly fine-tuned. If the force of gravity had been 0.00001% different, or nuclear forces, or any one of the main forces, right? I think there's 6 of them, but you would know better than me. Electromagnetic. If any one of those forces had been just a fraction different, there would be no creation. Things wouldn't have bound together. So that's called fine-tuning. It's so fine-tuned, it's impossible to conceive that came about by chance. That's the modern fine-tuning argument, because the intelligent design has 2 real categories. One is there are gaps in the archaeological record. There's jumps in the species and the evolution of species that cannot be accounted for by Darwinistic principles, and therefore God needs to have masterminded that jump in the evolution of the species. That's a very dangerous argument, because we may not have found the intermediary species now, but at any point they can be discovered in the archaeological record, and then the argument goes out the window. And in fact, the detractors of that argument call it the God of the gaps. There's gaps in the archaeological record, there's huge leaps, right? I forget the names, the Cumbrian, whatever the levels in the archaeological record, I can't remember the names. I've read a few books on it, but I can't remember all the terminologies. That there is this sort of slow evolution. All of a sudden, there's this really almost overnight, from the perspective of the entire archaeological record, overnight huge leap in the development of species that cannot be accounted for by the principles of evolution, which are gradual. And so some argue that only God could have caused that jump to happen. It's called the God of the gaps, right? That's one aspect of intelligent design, which I feel is very, very dangerous, because we haven't discovered any intermediary links now, but archaeology is consistently revealing, these sort of missing links. And so that's a very dangerous argument, because if these missing links are accounted for in other ways, naturalistic ways, then out goes your God. But the fine-tuning argument is a much more powerful argument. That any one of the forces that we call forces like gravity, right, electromagnetic force and so forth, had been slightly, minusculely different. Only one out of all the forces, there could have been no creation. And therefore there must be intelligence to fine-tune things to that extent. It's called the fine-tuning argument. And that, I think, is a much safer argument for theists, because you can't disprove that. So that's intelligent design. And so the Īśvara traditions are essentially articulating, according to their knowledge of physics, intelligent design arguments. But what they include also is karma, which is not included in modern intelligent design arguments in the West. The law of karma is not accepted by modern scientists, but the ancient thinkers of India, the logicians, in addition to the fine-tuning arguments that are similar to those in the West, but they also have an additional one that somebody has to oversee karma, the connection of fruits of activity with the causes. That I act, that the fruit comes back to me and not back to somebody else. It's got to come back to me at the same time as all the fruits are coming back to all the, and this, we froze time in this moment. All living entities are receiving their fruits at exactly the same time that I am, including the bugs under my feet, the ants in the field, birds in the tree. Also, it needs an omniscient being to make sure all of that can, it's just kind of a fine-tuning argument, but in a sort of karmic garb. So that will be one of the arguments that logicians would use in addition to other fine-tuning arguments. Okay, so that's it. Now we go back to theism. We've had a couple of weeks, had a little look at the Buddhists, right? Their main argument is change. If God creates, if there is a God, he changes, and you can't say, because it's pre-creation God, post-creation God, then that involves change. So that's the main argument we find from the Buddhist side. Then pretty much everyone talks about, well, why is there suffering, right? And again, the atheists of our modern day and age in the West will use the same arguments. Why is there suffering if there's a God, if God is kind? So that's a sort of universal argument. What would be the motive of creation? That's as we've seen that surface in numerous non-theistic arguments, and the arguments were borrowed between the schools. So we see them recycling, if you will. Okay, well, I hope you got something out of all of that, and maybe this was a little bit tricky, and I hope you didn't struggle too much with it. Please remember the argument of Pallas and the creator, the Pallas and the producer, the product and the producer. That just like a palace has to have a producer, the two arguments. So the universe does, and there has to be someone to bring together the animate and the inanimate, the ox and the cart, the soul and the world, and the Yukta Deepika then rejects those arguments, mostly because we don't have any examples of that. So that's it. Call it a day, and we'll meet you. And then, so the next lecture, that will be the second lecture for this week, will be Professor Dusty, who's the author of our book, our reader, the only book that you had to buy for the course, God in Indian Philosophy. It's short, 45 minutes. So, but it's he's very thorough, very meticulous. He's a good philosopher, and as I told you, he's a student at Rutgers, so you might be interested in somebody that was sitting where you're sitting now 20 years ago, or less than that, 15 years ago, is now a professor at Bridgewater State University. So that hopefully that'll be useful for you to meet the author of the book. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you next week.